Christian, when we cease to have a real, alive relationship with Christ, we experience atrophy. When we do not receive spiritual nourishment, it causes atrophy. These Christians were in danger of spiritual atrophy. You see, because they were dull of hearing, they never moved past the milk. As you grow, you need to what? When you're a baby, you start drinking milk. And then it comes to a point, what has to happen? You need to start eating solid food. And you can't just stay on milk. Because if you do just stay on milk, what happens? Ultimately, you become malnourished. Spiritually, you become weak. And eventually, that malnourishment leads to starvation. Think about it. Have you ever seen what starvation does to a body? Maybe you haven't seen it in real life, but maybe you have the unfortunate situation of seeing it on TV. Starvation around the world does happen. You know, it does even happen in Winnipeg. Everything atrophies. But when you think of starvation, the first thing that comes to your mind is the physical effect of atrophy. Sure, tissue shrivels up, bones become weak, and then eventually maybe you'll lose all your hair, and then you'll have no strength. Disease will become something that comes to you very easily. Why? Because you have no immunity. But church, I'm here to tell you that not only is there a physical effect, but there is also an emotional and mental effect as well. What happens when you starve is that the brain stops developing. And for many, the mind stays the mind of a child. Have you ever seen somebody who's starving? Are they happy? Are they joyous? No, all you see is somebody who has no smile. You see an emptiness. You see somebody with no joy. You see somebody who just experiences misery. And they can't fight off the disease of the body and of the mind. So what you can possibly have is you'll be looking at somebody who is at the age of an adult. But what you see and you can experience is somebody who only has the mind and body of a child. This is exactly what happens to people spiritually. When you become spiritually immature, you become weak. And you can't fight off spiritual disease. When you are tempted, it's so easy to fall into that temptation because you are spiritually immature. When you are spiritually immature, church, you are weak. You and I are helpless. Spiritual immaturity is like a silent disease. Now, you might not notice it at first. Now, it all starts with becoming dull of hearing. In other words, I think the young people here today is very well acquainted with this amazing phenomenon. In other words, what you experience is selective hearing. Who here has a friend that talks too much? Do you ever have that friend and you're in full conversation, you're sitting right across or standing right across from them, and all you hear is blah, 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 blah. And you know what I did this weekend? Blah, 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 blah. And you're doing this, you're shaking your head, you're saying, yeah, no problem. But ultimately, you didn't hear everything they said because you experienced and you were practicing selective hearing. God's voice becomes drowned out by other things. Gradually, when you experience spiritual immaturity, you start investing your emotional energy in other things. Think about your life. Perhaps you may have been really involved in the ministry within the church, and then all of a sudden you started to pull back. Less and less time was being used serving in ministry. But you're still really busy, right? You're busy with the business of life. But the problem is that God is not part of your business. You start to pray less. You start to read less. You just start to think less and less about God. And here's the scary thing. You just start to live life. And the final step is you start coming to praise and worship God less and less. Isn't that terrible? And the scary thing is that it didn't even hurt. In fact, that transition was so gradual. Your connection with God, because because of your spiritual immaturity, because you became stagnant in your faith, it happened so gradually that you did not even feel it. Which leads me to the next point. Stagnation leads to senselessness. We have senses with which to discern the world around us, right? We have the ability to see, we have the ability to hear, of feeling, smelling, touching. There's also a spiritual sense connected to all of this. You can get to the point where your senses can potentially become dull too. So does the text teach this? Well, let's look at it again. Hebrews chapter 5, verses 13 to 14. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is what? He is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are full of age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern good and evil. Senses are trained through solid food, church, and practice. You must have solid food, which means moving past the ABCs, which means moving past the fundamentals. You must have practice. So what do we mean by senses? Well, let's look and break down the word senses. The noun for senses is a feeling or perception through your senses, a faculty of the mind, such as a moral sense, mental discernment, and intelligence. The adjective is sensible, showing sound judgment, to be keenly aware of. The synonym is intelligent, rationale, observant, understanding. And the antonym is senseless, it is stupid. In the word for Greek, the word for senses is eistateria. And what that means is the power of discernment. Do you know what that is? The power of discernment. The word senses is our ability to perceive, to understand, to judge, and to discern things. Think about if you've ever had a baby. As a baby, you start learning how to perceive things. And you start to look and play with things because you want to understand how the world operates. But as a parent, what do you have to do? Well, you know a baby's on the way, so you have to baby-proof the house. Why do you have to baby-proof the house? Because a baby, regardless of how much you watch them, they get into everything. They put their mouth in things and things in their mouth, and if it's not a toy, that's when they usually want to play with it. But as a parent, you want them to learn without getting injured. So our children learn through teaching, and especially through practice. Imagine for a moment that all your life you have been blind. Imagine that since birth, you have only been in complete darkness. And then out of the miraculous surgeons and technology, all of a sudden, there was new surgery that you could be a part of. And then all of a sudden, one day, you go in, you come out, and you receive your sight. The fact of the matter is that you would see, but you do not know what you are looking at. Maybe the person might show you this, and you'd look at it and you'd say, what in the world is that? But if you put it in their hand, they touched it, they would say, oh, I know what that is. That's a microphone. The sense of sight needs to be trained to discern things. The same is with our spiritual sense. We need to learn to see, to understand, to discern, and to perceive things. If not, we can wind up injuring ourselves, our relationship with one another, and our relationship with God. Church, we gain the power of discernment through a real relationship. I'm not just talking about something that's once a week, you come to church once a week, and you call yourself a Christian because you have a supposed relationship with God. I'm talking about a faith that is real. I'm talking about a faith that is alive in Christ, one that is not stagnant. And through a deeper understanding and examining of the Bible. That is the type of faith I'm talking about. When we have the power of discernment, we recognize when we look at something, and we can discern that that thing might be evil, that thing is ungodly, and that thing is wrong. So, the devastation of stagnation. Are you stagnant in your faith walk with Christ. It doesn't matter what it is. I don't know what your troubles and your tribulations are, but God does. Whether it's swearing, or maybe it's taking the Lord's name in vain, or maybe it's engaging in premarital sex, or maybe it's dishonoring your parents by arguing and yelling at them and slamming the door on their face, and instead of what you're supposed to be doing is listening, because you might learn something, all you do is just yell and get angry at them. Or maybe it's that you're spending too much time at work and you're justifying, I'm working hard so I can provide for my family, but what happens? Your family and the relationship with your wife, with your children, can eventually deteriorate. Because instead of it growing, it becomes stagnant. And when you have a close relationship with Christ, I promise you today that you will recognize the injustices as being offensive to God. You start practicing and you start learning what real unconditional love is, what truth is, what is equality, what is humility, what is faithfulness, what is commitment and dedication. You will start to experience other qualities that stem from God. And you will have the power of discernment, because it means we have the ability to evaluate all things through the eyes of the Creator. But that will be